Well, hello again, companions, and welcome to this, the third of my short talks on the history and development of the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Scotland, and in particular, the Order of Royal Arch Freemasonries. Welcome to those who are listening as companions, but also just as listeners who want to find out more about our history and our development. We are an organisation committed, absolutely committed to companionship and service of others. And that's what forms the basis of the Order of Royal Arch Freemasonry in Scotland. Today I'm recording from Angus on a very dreary wet day in the middle of June. And of course that's what we might expect for Scottish weather. But I'm also sporting the tie of Glasgow Cryptic Council number 50. And if you've never studied what goes on in a cryptic council, I would encourage you to do it, as the degrees are wonderful and offer great enlightenment about the moral teachings behind the symbols and the stories that are to be told. And if you want to see the degree worked at its best, then I recommend that you actually go and see it done at Glasgow Cryptic Council number 50. I was particularly moved and enjoyed attending there last year. Now let me get back to where we are in our story. We're entering the Royal Arch history in Scotland in the 19th and the 20th century, and there's a great uncertainty around about the structures and much discussion, which is loved by Freemasons, about the degrees and how to move forward, and who will be responsible for what degree. In 1819, the Royal Grand Conclave and the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter for Scotland met to agree who would govern the degrees they had in common. There was some 19 degrees relevant to both orders. 12 degrees associated with Royal Arch Freemasonry, as it was practised then, were then placed under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter for Scotland. Some of these degrees, quite rightly, fell into abeyance and were quickly left unused. Others, such as the excellent, the super excellent, and their arch degrees, were combined to what we know to and refer to as the passing of the veils within the excellent master's degree. This sorting out is something that organisations have to do on occasions and to move them forward in terms of their understanding, but above all, to make them fit for purpose in the times in which they are placed. So this period in our Royal Arch history, the 19th and the early 20th century, we sorted things out. And we managed during this period to make sense of the number of strands of Freemasonry that had been brought together in what we now call Royal Arch Freemasonry. And from it, we created a coherent system, the system of the Order of Royal Arch Freemasons in Scotland. Other degrees developed into what we know now as the Royal Arch Mariners degrees, and the creation of lodges and councils that we can recognise today. These degrees of the captivity or the Babylonish pass were all worked under the Royal Arch Charter at the times. At this time, membership of the Royal Arch was restricted to Masters in the Chair or Past Masters of Craft Lodge. This proved to be too restrictive, and the requirements were removed in the middle of the 19th century, and to this day there is no requirement to be a Master of the Craft to become a principal in our Scottish chapters. On a personal note, I did the Principal Chair degrees of the Royal Arch before I became Master of a Lodge. Let's go back to our history then. From around 1830s, the Mark degree was in Scotland solely the responsibility of the Royal Arch degrees. However, by 1860, there was joint jurisdiction in this degree with the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Scotland and the Grand Lodge of Scotland, and this subsists to today. So from this period of sorting out the degrees and establishing modern, workable and sustainable systems of Freemasonry, emerged what we know as Royal Arch Freemasonry: the Mark degree, the Excellent Master's degree and the Royal Arch degree, alongside with their relevant chair degrees, made the foundation that our order developed and moved into the 20th century to push itself into a world that awaited it. In the early part of the 20th century, some of the regulations that were around us required further expansion. For example, let me refer to the Cryptic Council degrees. They had always been under the jurisdiction of the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Scotland, and it was a kind of loose arrangement until 1916. The Cryptic Council degrees were introduced to Scotland from Illinois in the United States of America in 1877, something that's often forgotten, and again a rich part of our history, that much of Royal Arch Freemasonry came to Scotland from others. At the beginning of the 20th century, new chapters were issued with charters, and also the workings of lodges and councils and cryptic councils were set up under their own charters. Administratively and jurisdictionally, the cryptic councils and the lodges and councils, along with their degrees worked in them, came under the government of the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Scotland, and that remains to today. Anyone who tells you that Freemasonry is fixed and unchangeable really doesn't understand the system. As we grow in understanding and as we grow in the principles which are fixed in our order, such as the principle of companionship and the principle of charity, which are key to Royal Arch Freemasonry, we grow in understanding and how to deliver that in a new world in which faces us on a day-to-day basis. This system of degrees was worked to engage the companions and to keep them moving forward in progression of understanding and knowledge. And if you think about it, by this time the Royal Arch Freemasons degrees were actually placed into a cohesive and story that moved through a number of important lessons to make good men better men. And it also engaged visiting companions in the stories that were told as they moved round from chapter to chapter, or from lodge and council or council. And it prepared and sought to prepare an understanding about what the building of the Second Temple brought to our understanding of how to be good people. Our history at this time can be described as a sorting out period. A period of sorting out and establishing a coherent and presentable system known as the Order of Scottish Freemasonry that would take us into the 20th and 21st century. Yes, it was confused. Yes, there's a lack of clarity in this period, but there is no lack of wishing to make the system presentable and fit for the age in which it was to come. And it came into that 20th century at a period just before the First World War, when there was much need in terms of an understanding of what it meant to be a companion and what it meant to be charitable. So we stand at the end of that period, that first 100 years from the establishment of the Supreme Grand Royal Arch Chapter of Scotland, and we've reached in our world history the momentous events of the First World War. In my next talk, I want to look again briefly at what the last 100 years has offered to Royal Arch Freemasonry, with its expansion, with its decline, and possibly at the end about how we are going to tackle our order in the world in which we are in today. Happy companionship, look after yourselves, and I look forward to being with you in the future.